All right, ninth grade. I hope you are doing well. We just have a very quick introduction to the book of Zechariah. In all reality, I don't think there's anything new here that you haven't seen in reading the rest of the prophetic books that we've read in this course. I simply want to just give us an anchor point as we move into post-exile prophecy in the Old Testament. So if you remember our timeline, we have pre-exile prophecy. That's prophecy that's anticipating exile. So if you remember those oracles, the prophetic oracles that we read in many of the beginning books, Isaiah, Amos, Micah, those books are filled with judgments. These judgments are geared towards not only Israel, but also the surrounding nations. And the judgments are such that the prophets were predicting an exile, predicting a punishment, that God was going to call upon them another nation, and that nation was going to take them into exile, was going to occupy their land. So we have to remember going all the way back to the covenant of Abraham. If you remember in the covenant of Abraham, there were three important pieces of that covenant. A blessing of a family that will eventually become a nation, a blessing of land, and then the promise that through Abraham's family, rooted in a land, the world will be blessed. And so one of the core promises, one of the core aspects of the nation of Israel through the Old Testament is this idea that in order to be fulfilling the Abraham covenant, the covenant that God had with Abraham, the father of the faith for Israel, we have to remain in the land. But what we notice is that God is very particular about his expectations, his standards for how Israel must live in the land in order to stay in the land. And if they don't follow the expectations and the standards laid out in the Torah, in the book of Moses, then it says all the way back, it says that they're going to be removed from the land. They're not going to be able to stay in the land if they cannot adhere to the Torah. Because you got to remember, in order to bless people, you have to stay rooted. You have to build as a nation. You can't be a sojourner people wandering around in the desert and be blessing the nations around you. In order to bless it, you have to have your own stuff in order. You have to have your own family in order, your own community, your own nation in order, if you're going to bless the world. Okay, and so as we move through the prophetic books, we notice this predicting of judgment. Well, we know through the book of Daniel, through the end of Isaiah, that judgment does come, that the people don't repent, they don't turn back to the way of Yahweh, they don't turn back to the Torah, and they therefore are exiled from the land. They're removed, which for Israel, like I said, is the worst possible punishment. Because one key piece we have to remember is that what is in the land? What is the focal point? What is the central aspect of the land of Israel? It's the temple. The temple that really a majority of the Old Testament is centered around, the building of the temple, the place where God will dwell with his people. And so if they are removed from the land, what's going to happen to the temple? It's going to be destroyed. It's going to be occupied. It's going to be taken over by pagan worship and all the things that, as an Israelite person, would be the end of the world, would be the worst possible thing that can happen. And so through the book of Isaiah, through the book of Daniel, we see this exile take place. And we took a look at Daniel's life as a person in exile. And as God continued to work in and through not only Israel, but also the pagan kings, Nebuchadnezzar, these other kings, God worked through them. God even turned them towards him. He showed compassion and mercy on these leaders. And ultimately, through the guidance of Yahweh, Israel is released back to their land. And so the background content of Zechariah is simply that 20 years later, Zechariah shows up. So Zechariah is actually a part of this movement back towards the land. And you got to think about what this would have been like for the people of Israel to return to their land and to see that their temple is gone. The place that they believe Yahweh, the divine, dwelled is gone. What are we going to do? Well, they have to start building. They got to start rebuilding. And so that's where they begin. That's where the Old Testament picks up. This is begins the second temple aspect of the Old Testament. First temple is gone. Second temple takes place. And it changes the fabric of Israel. It really does. As you can see, the hope was lacking in Israel. There's a line in the book of Zechariah that says this is a time of small things. And that's really how they felt. And in some way, anybody who's gone through anything devastating in their life, they feel like things have been torn down. They feel like they're lacking hope. They're lacking trust in God. We see that in the Old Testament. That happens. These characters felt the same thing. And so we get to see them work through that as a people. Who was Zechariah? Well, Zechariah was a unique character because he was a priest and also a prophet. He came from a long family of priests in Israel, and that's sort of what gave him his unique place in leadership within Israel. The book is structured with a series of 9 visions. You're going to see that in your analysis sheets. You're going to be analyzing those 9 visions. That's where we're going to spend the most of our time. And then you will read the oracles as they return for the surrounding nation and for Israel. And just a few tips as you jump into the book here. Remember that the main genre is futuristic prophecy. So these are visions that God is giving to Zechariah to then tell the people, this is what God showed me. This is what I've seen, a vision. An angel appears to Zechariah, gives him a vision, which is not uncommon in the Old Testament and also in the New. And this book reads a lot like the New Testament book of Revelation in that way. The visions are filled with symbols and imagery, which again is not new for us in this class, not new for prophetic literature. It's not new for the genre of Old Testament prophecy. What we need to do is approach the book by allowing these images and symbols to activate our imagination. Allow them to grasp you, allow them to even be odd or shocking for a moment, and allow just the nature, the artistic nature of these visions to capture your mind. And then, as all I'm asking you to do in your analysis sheet is summarize the visions, but ask yourself, what do these symbolize? What do these mean? And because remember, symbols aren't fake; they're merely pointing at a true reality, and they're merely pointing at something that is true. Okay. And so this is not fiction, this is not fantasy, although it reads like it, but it's pointing to something that is true about God and about his care for the world and for Israel in the Old Testament and their return to the land. So keep that in mind, keep that background content in mind as you jump in, and I hope you enjoy the book of Zechariah.